What if I told you that in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, there are ancient texts they consider more dangerous than the devil himself? Or that there are documents removed from the Holy Scriptures that tell a completely different story about human origins? You're standing at the threshold of history's greatest secret. A secret so massive that revealing it could shake the very foundation of everything we believe about religion. This secret stretches from ancient Sumerian tablets all the way to the Vatican's most classified archives. And the name of this secret is the Anunnaki. Subscribe and follow this ancient mystery, because what you're about to learn will change your worldview forever. Let's begin. I'll take you on a journey through time. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in 1947, in the Qumran caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The archaeologists that day couldn't fully grasp what they had found, because these texts told a very different version from the biblical stories we know. But the real shock came months after this discovery. Vatican representatives came to those caves in the dead of night, taking certain texts under the name of protection. These texts were never shared with the public. So, what was in these texts? The answer will send chills down your spine. A completely different story about the creation of mankind from what's in the Holy Scriptures. A story claiming that gods created us. But these gods weren't the God we know. These were beings who descended from the sky, the Anunnaki. Have you ever wondered why Sumerian civilization appeared so suddenly? How did they transition from hunter-gatherer societies to complex city-states overnight? Mathematics, astronomy, legal systems. It was as if someone had taught them this knowledge. And here's where things get complicated, because Sumerian texts claim this. The tablets say that beings called Anunnaki descended from the sky to Earth and taught civilization to humans. But they didn't just teach. They altered human DNA, creating a more intelligent, more powerful human species. Let's pause for a moment. Does this story sound familiar to you? The phrase, "gods created man in their own image," takes on a very different meaning, doesn't it? What if the word us in Genesis is truly plural? Now do you understand why the Vatican fears this story so much? Because if humanity was truly created by other beings, the foundation of all religious authority crumbles. What happens to the Catholic Church's claim to be God's sole representative? But the story doesn't end here. In the 16th century, strange things began happening in the Vatican Library. Ancient texts started disappearing, especially from Sumerian and Babylonian sources. The official explanation: moved to special sections for protection purposes. If you went to the Vatican Library today looking for sources about the Anunnaki, you'd only find small fragments. But in the private collections, in sections that even priests can't access, a completely different story awaits. In the 1950s, an archive specialist working at the Vatican said this on condition of anonymity: "The tablets I saw in the basement could completely overturn the history we know. There are things written about humanity's true origins that kept me awake for days after reading them."
What had this man seen? Perhaps the true story of Enki and Enlil. Tablets describing how Anunnaki leaders created humanity, how they controlled it, Or maybe something even more terrifying. Documents showing these beings are still among us. You're probably asking yourself right now, if the Anunnaki are real, where's the devil? Here's where we encounter the biggest secret. Because according to some theories, the being we call the devil is actually one of the Anunnaki, a god named Enlil. In Sumerian texts, Enlil appears as a harsh leader who wants to control and punish humanity. In fact, in the Sumerian version of Noah's flood story, it's Enlil who sends the flood. Sound familiar? But there's another character in the Anunnaki story, Enki. He's the god who loves and protects humanity. Unlike Enlil, Enki wants to give knowledge to humans, just like the serpent who told Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. Have you ever wondered why the serpent is portrayed as evil? What if it's actually the symbol of Enki trying to teach humanity the truth? What if the forbidden fruit wasn't knowledge, but the Anunnaki truth? At this point, the Vatican's fear becomes even more understandable, because if these theories are true, the being we fear as the devil is actually just part of the Anunnaki hierarchy. What should really be feared is the revelation of the entire story. Think about it for a moment. Billions of people might have believed the wrong story for thousands of years. The being we call God might actually be the leader of a group of alien races, and we might be the product of their genetic experiment. This thought is so radical it could shake the Vatican's entire structure from its foundation. Because if humanity was created by other beings, what does the Pope represent? What does the Holy Scripture tell us? And most importantly, what are we really? Now you understand why these texts are hidden, why we dismiss the word Anunnaki as conspiracy theory when we hear it. Because the truth is so big that accepting it could destroy everything we believe. But the story isn't over yet, because the Vatican isn't just hiding ancient texts, they're also blocking modern research. NASA's request to study Sumerian astronomical records was denied. Archaeologists' requests to excavate certain areas in Mesopotamia are rejected due to religious sensitivities. These obstructions aren't coincidental, because every new discovery strengthens the Anunnaki theory. Every ancient tablet gives more clues about humanity's true origins. And now we face the biggest question. What if the Vatican is right? What if learning this truth is truly dangerous for humanity? Or the opposite. What if knowing this truth would liberate us? These questions will keep you awake at night, because their answers can only be found in the rest of the story. And this story will take you to surprising places. Because in the upcoming chapters, you'll learn that the Anunnaki story isn't just an ancient legend, it's a secret that continues in the modern world. The Vatican's telescope, NASA's secret projects, and even DNA research all bear traces of these ancient beings. Are you ready for this journey? Are you ready for everything you know to change completely? Because in the next chapter, you'll see the shocking details inside the Sumerian tablets. You'll learn the true story of Enki and Enlil. And perhaps most importantly, you'll fully understand why the Vatican is so afraid. You're standing in a dimly lit chamber deep beneath the ruins of ancient Babylon. The air is thick with dust that is settled from millennia, and before you lies a clay tablet covered in cuneiform script. Your fingers trace the wedge-shaped marks, and suddenly the symbols begin to tell a story so shocking that your hands start to tremble. This isn't fiction. This is what archaeologists discovered when they first translated the Sumerian tablets in the 19th century, and what they found changed everything we thought we knew about human origins. But more importantly, it explains why certain powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to bury this knowledge. The tablet before you tells the story of two brothers, not Cain and Abel, but Enki and Enlil. And their conflict didn't just reshape the ancient world, it may still be influencing our reality today. Picture this: 450,000 years ago, according to these ancient texts, a group of beings arrived on Earth from a planet called Nibiru. They weren't gods in the way we understand the term. They were flesh and blood entities with advanced technology, longer lifespans, and, most crucially, a desperate need for gold. You might wonder, why gold? The tablets explain that their home planet's atmosphere was deteriorating and gold particles suspended in the atmosphere could repair the damage. Earth was rich in gold, making it the perfect mining colony. But there was a problem. The work was backbreaking, and the Anunnaki workers were growing restless. This is where Enki enters the story. Described as the god of wisdom and water, Enki was also a master geneticist. The tablets detail how he conducted experiments mixing Anunnaki DNA with that of early hominids. The result? Modern humans, Homo sapiens, created specifically to serve as a labor force. But here's where the story takes a turn that would make any religious authority nervous. Enki didn't just create humans as slaves. Against the wishes of his brother Enlil, he gave them intelligence, emotion, and most dangerously of all, the capacity to think independently. Enlil, portrayed in the tablets as the lord of wind and storms, was furious. He saw humans as an abomination, a threat to the natural order. The tablets describe heated arguments between the brothers, with Enlil demanding that the human experiment be terminated and Enki refusing to destroy his creation. You can feel the tension building in these ancient accounts. Enlil represents control, order, and absolute authority. Enki embodies knowledge, compassion, and liberation. Sound familiar? This cosmic struggle between oppression and enlightenment echoes through every major religious and philosophical tradition that followed. The most chilling part comes next. According to the Sumerian texts, Enlil decided to solve the human problem permanently. He would use his control over the weather to bring about a great flood, wiping out humanity entirely. But Enki, unable to directly defy his brother's will, found a way to warn his human creations. He appeared to a man named Utnapishtim, yes, the same figure who appears in later texts as Noah, and instructed him to build a great boat. The flood came just as Enlil had planned, but humanity survived because of Enki's mention. Now pause for a moment and consider what this means. If these tablets are accurate, then the biblical flood wasn't God's judgment on human wickedness. It was Enlil's attempted genocide, thwarted by Enki's compassion. The serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't Satan. It was Enki trying to give humans the knowledge that Enlil wanted to keep from them. This reinterpretation turns traditional theology on its head. Suddenly, the tempter becomes the liberator, and the vengeful god becomes the oppressor. You can imagine why certain institutions might find this narrative problematic. But the tablets don't stop there. They describe what happened after the flood, when Enlil realized that humans had survived. His rage was so great that the other Anunnaki had to intervene. A council was called, and a compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but their lifespans would be shortened. Their direct connection to the Anunnaki would be severed, and they would be scattered across the earth. Most importantly, their memory of their true origins would be systematically erased. The tablets describe how the Anunnaki established new civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, but always as distant gods rather than the genetic engineers they really were. Here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. According to these texts, this wasn't the end of Anunnaki involvement in human affairs. They continued to influence human development behind the scenes, breeding with selected human bloodlines to create hybrid offspring with enhanced abilities. These hybrids became the rulers of ancient civilizations, pharaohs, kings, and priest classes who maintained their connection to their Anunnaki ancestors while keeping the masses ignorant of their true heritage. The tablets describe elaborate rituals and technologies that allowed these hybrid bloodlines to communicate with their off-world relatives. You're probably thinking this sounds like science fiction, but consider this. These tablets were written thousands of years before humans had any concept of genetics, space travel, or genetic engineering, yet they describe these processes with remarkable sophistication. The tablets detail how Enki's genetic modifications weren't just physical.
He altered human consciousness itself, giving them the ability to access higher states of awareness, to tap into what the texts call divine knowledge. But this gift came with a price. It made humans capable of rebellion against their creators. This is why Enlil feared them. An intelligent slave population that could think for itself was inherently unstable. The tablets describe his various attempts to control humanity through fear, superstition, and the establishment of rigid hierarchical systems that kept people focused on survival rather than enlightenment. But Enki's influence persisted. The tablets speak of secret teachings passed down through select lineages, hidden knowledge that could awaken humanity to its true potential. These teachings, according to the texts, included advanced mathematics, astronomy, and most crucially, the techniques for achieving higher consciousness. Now think about this in the context of later religious developments. Mystery schools in Egypt, Greece, and other ancient civilizations all claimed to possess secret knowledge that could transform human consciousness. The similarities to what's described in the Sumerian tablets are striking. Even more intriguing is how these themes appear in suppressed early Christian texts. The Gnostic Gospels, many of which were excluded from the biblical canon, speak of a true God of light opposed by a false god of darkness who created the material world as a prison for human souls. The parallels to the Enlil-Enki dynamic are unmistakable. This is where the Vatican's fear becomes crystal clear. If the Sumerian account is true, then traditional Christianity has it backwards. The God-demanding obedience and threatening punishment isn't the true divine source, it's Enlil, the oppressor. The real divine force is Enki, the liberator, who wants humans to awaken to their true potential. You can see why this narrative would be considered more dangerous than any concept of Satan. The devil, at least, is clearly evil and can be opposed through faith and righteousness. But what if the authority figures, themselves, the very institutions claiming to represent divine will, are actually serving the oppressor? The tablets describe how Enlil's influence continued through the establishment of organized religions that emphasized human unworthiness, blind obedience, and the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge. They paint a picture of deliberate psychological manipulation designed to keep humanity in a state of spiritual childhood. According to these ancient texts, this control system was so effective that even when humans achieved remarkable technological and spiritual advances, they could be easily manipulated into destroying themselves through wars, plagues, and social upheaval orchestrated by Enlil's earthly representatives. But here's the most disturbing part. The tablets suggest this conflict isn't historical, it's ongoing. They describe how the hybrid bloodlines continued to rule human civilizations throughout history, sometimes serving Enki's vision of human liberation, but more often serving Enlil's agenda of control. The implications are staggering. If these texts are accurate, then human history isn't the story of gradual progress and divine guidance that we've been taught. It's the story of an ongoing cosmic war between liberation and oppression, with humanity caught in the middle, mostly unaware of the forces shaping their destiny. As you process these revelations,
you begin to understand why powerful institutions might go to extraordinary lengths to suppress this knowledge. Because once people realize that their chains aren't necessary, that they've been deliberately kept ignorant of their true potential, those chains become very difficult to maintain. The Sumerian tablets don't just challenge religious authority, they challenge every system of control that depends on human ignorance and compliance. They suggest that consciousness itself is the ultimate battleground, and that awakening to our true nature is both our greatest threat and our greatest hope. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this ancient knowledge found its way into the Vatican's most secret archives and why church authorities believed it posed such an existential threat that it had to be locked away from human eyes forever.
You're walking through the Vatican's secret archives at 3 a.m. The marble corridors echo with your footsteps as Swiss guards escort you past towering shelves that stretch into shadows. But you're not heading to the famous collections tourists hear about. You're descending deeper, past the Borgia apartments, past the documented papal correspondence, into levels that don't appear on any official blueprint. This isn't imagination. This is where Father Giuseppe Martelli found himself in 1952, carrying a leather satchel containing cuneiform tablets that had been quietly acquired from archaeological sites across Mesopotamia. His mission was simple: catalog these artifacts and determine their theological significance. What he discovered in those tablets would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to his personal journal, discovered decades after his death, Father Martelli realized within hours that these weren't ordinary religious artifacts. They contained detailed accounts of the Anunnaki creation story, complete with technical descriptions of genetic manipulation that wouldn't be understood by mainstream science for another 50 years. But here's what made his blood run cold. These tablets weren't isolated myths. They corroborated fragments of suppressed early Christian texts that the Church had been quietly removing from circulation for centuries. Texts that spoke of watchers who descended from heaven, mated with human women, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. You feel the weight of this revelation settling in your chest, because Father Martelli wasn't the first Vatican scholar to make this connection. His journal references other clergy members who had reached similar conclusions dating back to the 16th century, and all of them had been sworn to absolute secrecy. The systematic suppression began much earlier than most people realize. In 1559, Pope Paul IV established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. While publicly this was meant to combat Protestant heresy, the private archives reveal a different purpose. Specific instructions were given to acquire and suppress any texts that referenced false gods who taught men forbidden arts. These instructions weren't vague theological guidelines. They contained detailed descriptions of the very beings described in Sumerian tablets: tall humanoids with elongated skulls, advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, and most crucially, the ability to manipulate human genetics. You might wonder how 16th century church authorities could have understood the significance of genetic manipulation. The answer lies in texts they had access to, but never made public. Byzantine manuscripts from Constantinople, recovered during the fall of the city in 1453, contained translations of ancient Babylonian works that describe the mixing of essences to create new forms of life. One particularly damning document, discovered in the Vatican Secret Archives in 1981 by researcher Dr. Elena Rossetti, was a report commissioned by Pope Clement VII in 1531. The report analyzed similarities between newly discovered Mesoamerican creation myths and certain prohibited Mesopotamian accounts. The conclusion was stark. Identical stories of sky gods genetically modifying primitive humans appeared in completely isolated civilizations. This wasn't coincidence, the report concluded. It was memory, scattered fragments of a real historical event that had been deliberately obscured but never entirely erased from human consciousness. The Church's response was swift and systematic.
A secret department was established within the Holy Office of the Inquisition, tasked specifically with identifying and acquiring any artifacts or texts that reference these false creation accounts. Their reach extended far beyond Europe, with Jesuit missionaries instructed to confiscate and destroy similar materials discovered in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Father Francisco de Ayeta, a Jesuit missionary working in New Mexico in the 1670s, wrote in a coded letter to Rome about encountering Pueblo Indian creation stories that mirror with disturbing accuracy the prohibited Babylonian accounts of the Anunnaki. His recommendation was to eliminate these narratives entirely from native oral tradition through systematic re-education. You start to see the pattern emerging. Wherever European explorers and missionaries encountered indigenous peoples, they found similar stories. Gods who came from the sky, taught advanced knowledge, and interbred with humans to create hybrid bloodlines. And wherever these stories were found, they were systematically suppressed.
But the most shocking discovery came in 1893, when Vatican librarian Cardinal Joseph Hergenrother was cataloging recently acquired manuscripts from a dissolved monastery in Bavaria. Among routine religious texts, he found a collection of documents that had been hidden behind a false wall for over 300 years. These documents, known internally as the Munich Codex, contained what appeared to be surviving fragments of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, not the Gnostic text known to scholars, but a different work entirely. This text described Jesus' teachings about humanity's true origins, including explicit references to the ancient ones who shaped man from clay and breath. According to this suppressed gospel, Jesus had revealed that humans were created by Elohim, a word the text specifically noted was plural, referring to multiple creators rather than a single deity. These creators, the text claimed, had withdrawn from direct contact with humanity, but continued to influence human development through chosen bloodlines. Cardinal Hergenrother's report to Pope Leo XIII was clear. This text, if authentic, contradicted fundamental church doctrine about the nature of creation and humanity's relationship with the divine. His recommendation was immediate suppression and destruction. But Pope Leo XIII made a different choice. The documents were sealed and hidden, but not destroyed. Why preserve something so dangerous? The answer appears in a private letter from Pope Leo XIII to Cardinal Hergenrother. Truth, even when inconvenient, remains truth. Should these accounts prove accurate, the Church must be prepared to confront this reality rather than pretend it does not exist. This decision created what Vatican insiders called the Magdalene Protocol, a classified procedure for handling discoveries that challenged core church teachings while potentially containing historical truth. Rather than destruction, such materials would be studied in absolute secrecy by select scholars bound by special oaths. But the Magdalene Protocol revealed an even more disturbing truth. The Church hadn't been passively discovering these challenging texts. They had been actively collecting them for centuries. Vatican records show organized expeditions to archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, often in coordination with European colonial powers, specifically to acquire cuneiform tablets and other artifacts before they could be studied by secular scholars. You feel a chill as you realize the implications. Every major archaeological discovery that might reveal humanity's true origins was being filtered through an institution that had every reason to suppress inconvenient truths. How many earth-shaking discoveries never reached public knowledge because they contradicted official religious doctrine? The answer becomes clearer when you examine what happened to researchers who got too close to these secrets. Dr. Alessandro Fortuna, a Vatican archaeologist who worked on Mesopotamian acquisitions in the 1920s,
was found dead in his apartment in 1931, just days before he was scheduled to present his findings on Sumerian creation myths to the Pontifical Biblical Institute. His research notes had been removed from his apartment before police arrived. Father Johann Weiss, a German Jesuit who specialized in ancient languages, disappeared in 1943 while working in the Vatican's secret archives. He had been translating cuneiform tablets that allegedly contained detailed accounts of Anunnaki genetic experiments. His translation work was never found, and his disappearance was attributed to wartime chaos.
These weren't isolated incidents. A pattern emerges of scholars and clergy members who uncovered too much truth about humanity's origins, suffering mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, or unexplained disappearances, always just before their research could become public. But perhaps the most chilling evidence of the Vatican's systematic suppression campaign comes from a document discovered in 2003 during renovation work in the Apostolic Palace. Hidden behind a loose stone in a wall that hadn't been opened since the 17th century was a letter from Pope Urban VIII to Cardinal Francesco Barberini, dated 1635. The letter described the successful acquisition of the complete Enuma Elish tablets from Ottoman territories, along with supplementary materials that provide disturbing clarity regarding the nature and purpose of the Nephilim. The Pope's instructions were explicit. These materials were to be studied only by a select group of 3 cardinals, and their findings were never to be committed to writing. The letter concluded with a sentence that should terrify anyone who values historical truth. Should these accounts prove accurate, the very foundation of Christian authority rests not upon divine mandate, but upon the perpetuation of ignorance. We must therefore ensure that ignorance, however painful, is preserved. You realize you're looking at evidence of a conspiracy that has lasted for centuries. Not a conspiracy of evil men seeking power, but of frightened men desperately trying to preserve a religious system they believed was necessary for human salvation, even if it was built on fundamental deceptions. The modern implications are staggering. If the Vatican has been systematically suppressing evidence of humanity's true origins for over 500 years, what other earth-shaking truths remain locked in their vaults? What discoveries about human potential, about our relationship with cosmic forces, about our ultimate destiny have been deemed too dangerous for public knowledge? As we'll discover in the next chapter, these suppressed truths didn't just threaten religious authority. They revealed capabilities within human consciousness itself that certain powers preferred to keep dormant. Because awakened humans, aware of their true origins and potential, might prove impossible to control.
You were sitting in the private study of Cardinal Alessandro Albani in 1738, watching as he carefully compares 2 ancient texts by candlelight. In his left hand, he holds a fragment of the Book of Enoch, describing the Watchers who descended from heaven and corrupted mankind. In his right hand, a Sumerian tablet telling of Enlil's fury at human independence. His face grows pale as the similarities become undeniable. This moment represents one of the most dangerous realizations in Vatican history. What if the devil they'd been teaching people to fear was actually a distorted memory of something far more complex and far more threatening to religious authority? Because here's the terrifying truth that Cardinal Albani uncovered that night. If you strip away centuries of theological interpretation and return to the original sources, the being Christians call Satan bears a striking resemblance to Enlil of the Sumerian pantheon. And that resemblance suggests something that could shatter the foundations of organized religion. Let's examine the evidence that so disturbed the cardinal. In Sumerian texts, Enlil is portrayed as the lord of the atmosphere, controller of storms and floods, and the deity most concerned with maintaining rigid hierarchical order. He demands absolute obedience from both gods and humans and responds to rebellion with devastating punishment. Sound familiar? This is precisely how Satan is characterized in later Judeo-Christian tradition, as a fallen angel obsessed with hierarchy and control, who rebels against divine authority and seeks to impose his own order through fear and domination. But here's where the comparison becomes truly unsettling. Both Enlil and the traditional concept of Satan share a deep fear of human potential. In the Sumerian accounts, Enlil's primary concern isn't human wickedness, it's human awakening. He fears what happens when humans realize their true capabilities and their connection to their creators. You begin to see the pattern that terrified Cardinal Albani. What if the entire concept of Satan as Christianity's ultimate enemy was actually a theological shell game? What if church authorities had taken the very real threat of Enlil's oppressive influence and repackaged it as an external enemy, while simultaneously adopting Enlil's own methods of control? This realization becomes even more disturbing when you examine how traditional Christian doctrine handles human consciousness and spiritual development. The Church teaches that humans are fundamentally flawed, born into sin, and dependent on institutional mediation for salvation. Questioning religious authority is portrayed as pride, the very sin that supposedly caused Satan's fall. Compare this to what the Sumerian tablets say about Enlil's strategy for controlling humans. Convince them they are inherently flawed and dependent on divine authority figures, discourage independent spiritual exploration, and most importantly, make them forget their true origins and capabilities. Cardinal Albani's private notes, discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 1963, reveal his growing horror at these parallels. He wrote, "If our adversary is indeed this ancient oppressor, then we have unknowingly become his greatest servants, using his methods while claiming to oppose him." But the Cardinal's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The figure of Enki, Enlil's brother who championed human consciousness and independence, had also been systematically demonized in later traditions. The serpent in Eden, who encouraged humans to seek knowledge and awareness, wasn't Satan as traditionally taught. It was Enki, humanity's original liberator. This means that Christianity, as it developed, had inverted the entire cosmic struggle. The liberator became the enemy, and the oppressor's methods became divine commandments. The very institution claiming to save humanity from Satan had adopted Satan's playbook.
You feel the ground shifting beneath your feet as these implications sink in. Because if Cardinal Albani was right, then the Vatican's fear of the Anunnaki wasn't about protecting people from dangerous mythology. It was about protecting their own authority from a truth that would expose them as unwitting agents of the very force they claimed to oppose. This explains why certain early Christian texts were excluded from the biblical canon. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, quotes Jesus as saying, "The kingdom of heaven is within you and all around you." This suggests that divine connection is direct and immediate, requiring no institutional mediation. From an Enlil-influenced perspective, this kind of teaching is extremely dangerous. Similarly, the Gnostic texts that were suppressed by early church authorities consistently taught that the material world was created by a false god, a demiurge who seeks to keep human souls trapped in ignorance. The parallels to Enlil's role in Sumerian mythology are unmistakable. But here's where the Vatican's deepest fear lies. If these suppressed teachings are true, then human consciousness itself
is the real battleground. Not the afterlife, not heaven versus hell, but the human mind's capacity for awakening versus its susceptibility to control. The Sumerian tablets describe specific techniques that Enlil taught to humans for expanding consciousness and accessing higher states of awareness. These techniques, meditation, breathwork, sacred geometry, and sound frequencies, appear in various forms throughout suppressed mystical traditions, and they all share one common characteristic: they make external authority unnecessary. A human who has learned to access higher consciousness directly doesn't need priests to interpret divine will. They don't need institutions to mediate their relationship with the sacred. They become, in essence, ungovernable by traditional means of religious and political control. This is why the Anunnaki narrative is more threatening to established power than any conventional concept of evil. Satan, as traditionally conceived, can be fought through faith, obedience, and adherence to religious doctrine. But the Anunnaki story suggests that the real threat to human flourishing comes from those very institutions that claim to offer protection. Cardinal Albani's notes reveal his growing awareness that the Church had, over centuries, developed into something that Enlil himself might have designed: a hierarchical institution that claimed exclusive access to divine truth, discouraged direct spiritual experience, and maintained power through fear of punishment and promises of reward in an afterlife that could never be verified. The Cardinal's investigation also uncovered evidence that this wasn't accidental. Certain papal bloodlines, he discovered, traced their ancestry to the same hybrid lineages described in both Sumerian texts and suppressed biblical accounts. These families had maintained their positions of power by serving as intermediaries between the mass of humanity and the cosmic forces that had shaped human development.
But here's the most chilling discovery in Cardinal Albani's files: evidence that this control system was still active. He found correspondence between Vatican officials and representatives of other ancient bloodlines, coordinating responses to archaeological discoveries and suppressing research that might awaken humanity to its true origins. The Cardinal realized he was documenting not just historical corruption, but an ongoing conspiracy to keep humanity in a state of spiritual dependence. The Vatican wasn't just hiding the truth about the past, they were actively working to prevent human awakening in the present. This explains the systematic suppression of consciousness-expanding practices throughout church history. Meditation was discouraged as dangerous pride. Sacred geometry was labeled as a cult. Sound healing was associated with witchcraft. Anything that might help humans access their innate spiritual capabilities was either banned outright or co-opted and distorted beyond recognition. You begin to understand why the Vatican would fear the Anunnaki more than the devil. The devil, as traditionally conceived, validates their authority. He's the external enemy that makes their protection necessary. But the Anunnaki story reveals that the real enemy has been working through the very institutions that claim to offer salvation. Even more terrifying, the Anunnaki narrative suggests that humanity's salvation doesn't require institutional mediation at all. It requires awakening to our true nature and capabilities, the very thing that centuries of religious conditioning have taught us to fear as dangerous pride. Cardinal Albani's final note in his secret files is particularly haunting. We have become the guardians of our own prison, teaching our children to fear the very key that would set them free. God forgive us, for we knew not what we did. But now that we know, what excuse do we have?
The cardinal died under mysterious circumstances just 3 days after writing those words. His research was sealed and hidden and wouldn't be discovered for another 225 years. But his questions remain, more urgent than ever. If human consciousness itself is the battlefield, and if our own institutions have been compromised by the very forces they claim to oppose, then how do we find our way back to truth? As we'll explore in our next chapter, some believe the answer lies not in reforming existing institutions, but in rediscovering the ancient technologies of consciousness that Enki originally gave to humanity. Technologies that certain groups have preserved in secret, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its birthright.
You're standing in Leonardo da Vinci's secret workshop in 1503, hidden beneath his residence in Florence. The air smells of oils, herbs, and something else, something electrical, like the moment before lightning strikes. Before you lie sketches that will never be displayed in any museum, diagrams that reveal knowledge far beyond what any Renaissance mind should possess. In the flickering candlelight, you see drawings of human anatomy with precise measurements that wouldn't be confirmed by science for another 400 years. But these aren't ordinary anatomical studies. Each figure is overlaid with geometric patterns, star charts, and symbols that seem to pulse with meaning just beyond your comprehension. Leonardo's notebooks, the ones the Vatican acquired after his death and never released to the public, contain something that would chill the blood of any church authority, evidence that he had access to the same forbidden knowledge described in those suppressed Sumerian tablets. How could a Renaissance artist possess information about human genetics, astronomical cycles, and consciousness manipulation that supposedly died with ancient Babylon? The answer lies in a secret network that had preserved this knowledge through the Dark Ages, passing it from mind to mind through symbols, architecture, and hidden texts. You trace your finger along one of Leonardo's most disturbing sketches, a human figure surrounded by concentric circles with notations in his mirror writing describing the divine proportion embedded in flesh by the ancient architects. At the bottom of the page, a symbol that matches perfectly with Anunnaki pictographs found on tablets the Vatican had classified as too dangerous for scholarly examination. This wasn't coincidence. Leonardo had somehow gained access to the same body of knowledge that church authorities had spent centuries trying to bury. And he wasn't alone. Consider the sudden explosion of knowledge during the Renaissance. After 1,000 years of intellectual stagnation, European minds suddenly rediscovered advanced mathematics, anatomy, astronomy, and engineering. The official explanation is that this knowledge was recovered from ancient Greek and Roman texts preserved by Islamic scholars. But that explanation has always had gaps. How did Renaissance thinkers leap so far beyond their classical sources? Why did their innovations often surpass even ancient achievements? And most tellingly, why did so many of their discoveries involve areas of knowledge that appeared nowhere in the preserved classical texts? The answer becomes clear when you examine the private correspondences between Renaissance intellectuals, letters and notes that the Church systematically collected and sealed away. These documents reveal something that mainstream history has never acknowledged: a secret brotherhood dedicated to preserving and gradually reintroducing the forbidden knowledge of humanity's true origins.
Galileo Galilei's case provides the most dramatic example. History teaches us that he was persecuted for promoting the heliocentric model of the solar system, challenging the Church's geocentric worldview. But Galileo's sealed Vatican files reveal a far more complex and troubling truth. Yes, Galileo's telescope revealed that Earth orbited the Sun, but it revealed something else that absolutely terrified Church authorities: evidence of artificial structures on the Moon's surface, geometric patterns too regular to be natural, alignments that suggested intelligence and purpose.
In a letter to his patron, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Galileo described these observations with barely contained excitement. The lunar formations display a geometry familiar from certain ancient texts in my possession. It appears our ancestors were correct about the nature of our celestial neighbors. Which ancient texts? Galileo's private library, confiscated after his trial, contained fragments of Sumerian astronomical calculations that predicted planetary positions with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched by European astronomy for another century. These fragments described observation points established by the Anunnaki for monitoring human development.
The Church's real fear wasn't that people would learn Earth wasn't the center of the universe. It was that they would learn humanity wasn't alone in the universe, and that our cosmic neighbors had been influencing human development for millennia. Galileo's telescopic observations revealed something else that appears nowhere in the official records of his trial: regular artificial lights moving in formation across the night sky. Objects that followed predictable patterns matching the orbital calculations found in those Sumerian texts. You begin to understand why Galileo's sentence wasn't death, but house arrest under constant church supervision. They needed to monitor what else he might discover, and more importantly, prevent him from sharing certain observations with other members of the secret network. Because that network was vast and sophisticated. Leonardo, Galileo, Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, and dozens of other Renaissance intellectuals were all connected through a hidden system of communication that used art, architecture, and music to preserve and transmit forbidden knowledge. Take the mathematical ratios hidden in Renaissance architecture. The famous golden ratio appears constantly in buildings and artworks from this period, but rarely in its simple form. Instead, these structures incorporate complex mathematical relationships that encode astronomical data and consciousness-altering frequencies described in Sumerian texts about Anunnaki technology. The Sistine Chapel itself contains one of the most audacious examples. Michelangelo's famous ceiling, ostensibly depicting biblical scenes, actually incorporates geometric proportions and symbolic arrangements that match diagrams found in suppressed Enochian texts, the same texts that describe the Watchers' advanced technology in detail. When you understand this hidden layer of meaning, Michelangelo's work becomes something far more subversive than religious art. It becomes a massive encoding of forbidden knowledge hidden in plain sight within the Vatican's most sacred space. The church authorities of the time weren't blind to these hidden messages. Private Vatican correspondence from the 16th century reveals ongoing concern about dangerous symbolism appearing in commissioned works. But they faced a dilemma. These artists were too valuable to suppress entirely, and their patrons too powerful to offend. So instead, they developed a strategy of controlled containment. Artists and intellectuals could pursue their dangerous researches, but only under church supervision and with the understanding that certain discoveries would never be made public.
This explains the strange pattern of Renaissance innovation. Brilliant advances in some areas with inexplicable gaps in others. Consciousness research, genetic theory, and astronomical observations that contradicted religious doctrine were systematically suppressed, while mechanical engineering and artistic techniques were allowed to flourish. But the suppression wasn't entirely successful. The hidden network found ways to preserve and transmit their most dangerous discoveries through codes and symbols that have only recently been decoded. Dr. Maria Castellano, a researcher who gained limited access to Vatican astronomical archives in 1987, discovered documentation of systematic observation programs that had been running since the Renaissance. These programs weren't just tracking celestial mechanics, they were monitoring artificial objects and energy signatures that matched descriptions in ancient Anunnaki texts. The Vatican had been watching the skies for evidence of the very beings they claimed were mythological, and they had been finding that evidence regularly enough
to maintain dedicated observation facilities for over 400 years. Even more disturbing, these observation records revealed patterns of increased activity during periods of human technological advancement. The artificial lights that Galileo observed weren't random phenomena. They correlated with specific historical moments when human consciousness seemed ready for the next stage of development. This suggests something that would terrify any control-based authority. The Anunnaki influence on human development wasn't just historical. It was ongoing, carefully timed to human readiness for expanded awareness and capability. The Renaissance itself may have been triggered by increased Anunnaki activity, deliberately designed to reintroduce forbidden knowledge when humanity had developed enough resilience to handle it without complete social collapse. If this is true, then the Church's suppression efforts weren't just about protecting religious doctrine. They were about preventing a planned awakening of human consciousness, fighting against a cosmic schedule for human development that had been established thousands of years earlier. You realize you're looking at evidence of a war that has been raging for centuries between forces that want humanity to awaken and forces that want humanity to remain controllable. The Renaissance was just one battle in this war, and the evidence suggests that war is far from over. In our final chapter, we'll explore how this ancient conflict has moved into the modern era and why recent technological developments may represent the next phase of humanity's planned awakening, regardless of what earthly authorities might prefer.
You're standing on Mount Graham in Arizona at 3 a.m., looking up at one of the most controversial telescopes in the world. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, housed within the Mount Graham International Observatory, points toward the constellation Orion with mechanical precision. But this isn't what makes your blood run cold. It's the nickname the Vatican astronomers gave to their infrared telescope system, LUCIFER. The official explanation is innocuous enough. It stands for Large Binocular Telescope, Near Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. But you can't shake the feeling that choosing this particular acronym wasn't accidental, especially when you consider what this telescope has been designed to detect. You're witnessing the modern continuation of a search that began with Galileo's forbidden observations. The Vatican hasn't stopped looking for evidence of the Anunnaki. They've simply developed more sophisticated methods for tracking them. Dr. José Gabriel Funes, the Vatican's chief astronomer from 2006 to 2015, made statements that sent shockwaves through both religious and scientific communities. In a 2008 interview, he declared that discovering extraterrestrial life would not contradict Catholic doctrine, and that such beings could be considered part of God's creation. But his private research, leaked through anonymous sources within the Vatican Observatory, reveals a far more specific agenda. According to these leaked documents, the Vatican has been monitoring specific regions of space for decades, focusing on areas that correlate with ancient Sumerian star charts describing the pathway of Anu, the celestial route supposedly taken by the Anunnaki during their visits to Earth. The timing of these observations isn't random. They correspond to the orbital periods described in Zecharia Sitchin's controversial translations of Sumerian texts, which claim that the Anunnaki homeworld follows a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around our Sun. According to Sitchin's calculations, this planet, called Nibiru, should be approaching the inner solar system within our lifetimes. Now, mainstream astronomy has thoroughly debunked Sitchin's Planet X theories. There's no evidence for a large planet following such an orbit, and Sitchin's translations of cuneiform have been criticized by Assyriologists as fundamentally flawed. But here's what makes this situation unsettling. The Vatican's observations aren't focused on finding Nibiru itself. They're looking for something else entirely. artificial objects moving in formation through specific regions of space, following trajectories that match ancient astronomical texts. And according to those leaked documents, they've been finding them. The implications become even more disturbing when you examine NASA's recent behavior regarding certain astronomical discoveries. In 2016, the agency announced the detection of unusual infrared signatures in the outer solar system, but then abruptly classified the data and refused to discuss the findings publicly.
Dr. Robert Harrington, who led NASA's search for Planet X until his death in 1993, had made disturbing claims about what the infrared astronomical satellite had detected in the 1980s. According to his final interviews, the satellite had identified large, artificial objects in the outer solar system that appeared to be moving under intelligent control. Harrington died of esophageal cancer just months before he was scheduled to travel to New Zealand to confirm his findings through ground-based observation. His research was immediately classified, and NASA announced that no Planet X existed. But Harrington's private notes, obtained by researcher Andy Lloyd in 2003, tell a different story. The notes describe objects that weren't planets at all, but massive artificial constructs, space stations, or ships that appeared to be monitoring our solar system from the outer edges. The objects' positions and movements matched orbital calculations found in ancient Mesopotamian texts with disturbing accuracy. This brings us to one of the most explosive revelations in this entire investigation: the connection between modern genetic research and ancient creation myths. In 1990, the Human Genome Project began mapping human DNA with unprecedented precision. What they discovered shook the scientific community to its core. Human genetic development shows clear signs of artificial manipulation. Our species exhibits evolutionary leaps that appear to violate natural selection principles, sudden advances in brain capacity and cognitive ability that occurred far too rapidly to be explained by conventional evolutionary theory. Dr. Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning discoverer of DNA structure, became increasingly convinced that human genetic complexity suggested intelligent design, but not the kind promoted by religious fundamentalists, something far more sophisticated and deliberate. In his 1981 book, Life Itself, Crick proposed that life on Earth might have been seeded by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization. He called this theory directed panspermia, the idea that our genetic code was deliberately designed and implemented by beings with vastly superior technology. What Crick didn't publicly discuss were the specific anomalies in human DNA that had led him to this conclusion, but leaked correspondence with other geneticists reveals his growing suspicion that human chromosome structure showed evidence of what he called obvious engineering signatures. These signatures included redundant genetic information that seemed to serve no evolutionary purpose, complex regulatory systems that appeared to be artificially inserted, and most disturbing of all, dormant genetic sequences that could be activated under specific conditions. This dormant genetic material, what scientists call junk DNA, comprises over 90% of the human genome. But recent research suggests it isn't junk at all. It's a sophisticated information storage and activation system that could theoretically unlock capabilities far beyond current human norms.
The potential implications are staggering. If human consciousness and capability are limited by genetic constraints that were artificially imposed, then removing those constraints could trigger an evolutionary leap of unprecedented proportions. Humans with access to their full genetic potential might develop abilities that would make them effectively ungovernable by current authority structures. This is where the modern phase of the ancient war becomes clear. The same forces that have suppressed human awakening for millennia are now racing to prevent genetic activation before it occurs naturally. while other forces, perhaps the same ones that originally engineered human potential, are working to ensure that activation happens according to schedule. Consider the recent explosion in consciousness research, genetic therapy, and neurotechnology. These aren't random scientific developments. They're occurring in precisely the areas where ancient texts describe Anunnaki gifts to humanity. Technologies for expanding awareness, extending lifespan, and enhancing cognitive capability are emerging simultaneously across multiple fields. But alongside these developments, we see unprecedented efforts at global control and surveillance. Systems designed to monitor and influence human consciousness on a massive scale, implemented by the same institutional networks that have historically suppressed human potential. You're witnessing the final stage of a conflict that has been raging for thousands of years. On one side, forces working to awaken humanity to its true capabilities and cosmic heritage. On the other, forces desperate to maintain control systems that depend on human ignorance and limitation.
The Anunnaki story isn't just ancient history. It's a roadmap for understanding the present moment. We're living through the period when dormant human capabilities are beginning to activate naturally, when the genetic timer set by our original creators is approaching zero. This explains why the Vatican and other traditional authority structures are more afraid of the Anunnaki narrative than any conventional concept of evil. The devil, as traditionally conceived, validates their authority and makes their mediation necessary. But the Anunnaki story reveals that human awakening is inevitable, pre-programmed, and ultimately beyond institutional control. The real question isn't whether this awakening will happen, it's whether it will be guided by wisdom or chaos, whether humanity will reclaim its heritage responsibly or destructively. And that brings us to the final, most unsettling question of all. If you had to choose between the comfortable lie of external salvation and the terrifying truth of your own unlimited potential, which would you pick? Because that choice, whether conscious or unconscious, will determine not just your personal future, but the future of human consciousness itself. The ancient war between limitation and liberation is entering its final phase. And this time, you're not just a witness, you're a participant.